All right, hey restorers, welcome to a fresh episode of the Restoration Today podcast. I am excited to talk a little bit. There's going to be a couple episodes coming out that are ahead of Interconnect because Interconnect obviously got rescheduled because of the California wildfires. And so that became a really timely topic for both the show. I know that some of the content I think has been pivoted a little bit to talk even more about the wildfires and the data surrounding it. And so this is just kind of the final push to talk about what's going to happen at Interconnect, some of the research and work that CoreLogic has been doing since the fires happened, all of those things. So I'm very excited to have Jon Schneyer with me. He is the Director of Research and Content with CoreLogic. So we're going to talk a lot about, again, wildfires and the risk aggregation, the data that CoreLogic has surrounding wildfires to help the industry better understand. Unfortunately, this isn't going to be the last time something like this happens. This is something that's becoming more and more common as we're seeing there are many fires all of us could list in recent history. So anyway, Jon, I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to toss it over to you to kind of introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background in the industry.
Of course. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much for having me. So, as the Director of Research and Content, in addition to overseeing our thought leadership, whether that be webinars and publications or helping out with conference material, I also oversee our event response service. And that's whenever there are big global natural disaster events, as the risk modeling data providing expert, it's on us to quantify that impact, and we can tailor that storyline to whatever industry. We typically think for the insurance industry at large, but whether that be on the claim side, underwriting, restoration, or cat risk management, and even in the other industries that we work closely with at CoreLogic, whether that be mortgage and lending, real estate, because all these industries are interested, of course, in the impacts of a large-scale natural disaster. And the LA wildfires were, in my tenure at CoreLogic, which is coming up on just about 3 years, right? This is the biggest natural disaster event we've had to respond to. The most eyes on it. It's certainly going to be the largest wildfire loss in U.S. history. It's a meaningful one, and rightly so. It's going to influence a lot of what we're going to talk about at Interconnect, because we'll be in Los Angeles, obviously, why we had to pivot to the March date. But we're happy to be able to not change the content, but be able to incorporate what we've learned and what we saw during the LA fires and speak about that at the conference.
Perfect. It sounds like you wear a lot of different hats. It's a lot of different hats to wear across the board at CoreLogic, especially when you have your hands in multiple industries, as I know CoreLogic as a whole does.
Absolutely. Yeah. I put on my analyst hat, I put on my public speaking hat, marketing hat, what have you. It ends up being, it's a fun job because I get to talk to a lot of really interesting people and learn a lot of new things every time there's a new event.
I love it. I'm sure you're never bored. Okay, so talk a little bit about CoreLogic's wildfire modeling, risk aggregation. What are some key factors that influence the accuracy of that? And kind of talk about maybe what you were seeing ahead of the California wildfires this time. Like, did you know it was coming? What did the risk look like?
It's a great question. This idea of should we have been surprised by the LA fires? And you can never, the problem with fires or earthquakes, you don't have a sense that they're coming. It's the beauty of a hurricane is we can see a hurricane coming, and we know usually before landfall where it's actually going to hit. And like I said, we don't have that benefit with wildfires. That being said, if you look back at just the general meteorology, climate conditions that were there in Southern California, going back to the summer, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that a fire could have broken out. So, between May and January, right? LA had about less than a quarter of an inch of rain over that entire period. So 0.16 inches in LA. And in a normal year, right? It's normal for it to be dry in LA in the summer.
Sure.
That's accepted.
Sure.
But in the winter, it tends to move to a slightly wetter climate. And normally in that 7-8 month period, usually get about 4 to 6 inches of rain, enough to abate wildfire risk for the most part. Not absolutely get rid of it, but it helps.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case this year, right? It's incredibly dry. Actually, it was the second driest start to the year in downtown LA since 1877. So incredibly dry start to the year. It was hot, it was dry, and of course it was windy. So we've all heard about the Santa Ana winds. Santa Ana winds are not something abnormal. They happen every year. The thing is, in the wintertime, when Santa Ana winds are some of the strongest. There's also a lot of rain as well that's associated with them, and that didn't happen this year.
Yeah.
So if you're just considering those factors, that it was hot, dry, and windy, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that there was a wildfire. We just never see that combination of factors in January.
Yeah.
All you need is a spark. And once there's a spark, something like what happened in LA could have happened.
Yeah.
So when we think about risk modeling, right, there's a couple of ways we think about it. We develop a lot of risk score models, hazard-based risk score models, things that consider vegetation, we call it fuel, vegetation, winds, general climate, like heat and humidity, the terrain, provide a risk score for that area. And that property that sits on that area has a risk score between 0 and 100. And this hazard-based risk score, right, is considering the wildfire risk in this area if there was no building there. There's risk, the grass in this area has high risk. And, where the fires broke out, our models show that these were areas of high risk. But what happened in LA was not unique, but it's what it did is it highlighted a phenomenon called a conflagration. So when the fire spread from the wildland urban interface, or the WUI, those are the areas surrounded by trees and grasses, those beautiful homes up in the hills, surrounded, beautiful landscaping. Right? We call that the WUI, typically high risk area there. But if you go down slope into Altadena or into the Palisades, when you're away from that wildland urban interface, you would expect risk to be lower, but that wasn't the case, because once the fire spread into the built environment, the buildings themselves became the fuel. It's no longer the vegetation that is fueling the fire. It's the homes catching on fire, the heat spreading from home to home, embers being able to travel and spread. Started the thing we call conflagrations. The same thing that happened in Lahaina in Maui back in 23. Same phenomenon. So this idea of being able to foresee conflagration risk is really important, and it's going to be a big focus at Interconnect this year.
Interesting. Okay. I honestly had to Google that word when I was coming up with the questions. I was like, what does that really mean? So I was, doing my own research trying to figure that out. So, okay, with CoreLogic having arms in different segments, how key is it to understand, or how helpful is it to understand from especially a risk perspective before the fires are even over? I think you had a good idea from, the restoration standpoint, the claim standpoint, hazard, all of that, a good idea of what things were looking like before the fires were even out, which took a while because of the winds and all that. So talk a little bit about bringing that data together and how that helps give a fuller picture because you have so many arms.
Sure. Now, what we really benefit from here at CoreLogic is we have a really good sense of what is there on the ground. And I'm talking about the properties and the buildings. And actually, it goes even beyond just a parcel. We have structure level information, whether that be pool houses or garages, what have you. That gives us a unique ability to quantify and understand the impact while the event is ongoing. And every day when we had a new perimeter, a wildfire perimeter, we would take our database of properties and we'd see how many of them are within that perimeter. And of course, that doesn't mean all of those burnt necessarily, but it gives you that sort of conservative or high-end estimate of what could happen. So it's not just the number that were at risk to being burnt. We know a lot about the value of those properties. We model the reconstruction cost value of every single property. Our models are the prices for individual components that comprise a home, whether that be lumber or roofing materials or windows, updated constantly. So the values of those homes are very well known. So when we say that there were 5,000 or 7,000 homes within the perimeter with a reconstruction cost value of $5 billion, for example, right? It's a pretty good high-end estimate of what's there at risk in the perimeter. It's a great first start. And that helps not only our insurance clients who are trying to get a sense of, what is the impact to my book or specifically, but we can help in the mortgage and lending space, because if you own a home and your home is impacted by the fires, you can file for something called forbearance. Basically, you can get pauses on your mortgage payments and pauses on the interest accrual while you are trying to get back to see if your home is damaged, clear the damage, and rebuild. So there's a lot of different industries that are interested in that and being able to contact the policyholders or mortgage or the homeowners who have a mortgage with these lenders. We can take it one step further. Once we have information on the actual damage of the properties within the perimeter. So we have a couple of different data streams that are feeding our analytics, and we have a really great partnership with a company called the Vexel Group. They provide aerial imagery. So when it's safe to do so, as soon as they can, they'll fly over the impacted areas, take photos, and our geospatial teams can look at those photos and process them and identify completely destroyed, heavily damaged, lightly damaged, or no damage. And we can tie that to an individual building. So we can say 123 Main Street, total loss, but 125 Main Street, only partial damage. We also can tie in CAL FIRE, goes in and identifies damaged structures. So does FEMA. We can incorporate all of that into a great visualization, so you can just see all of the red, basically all the totally destroyed properties across Altadena and Palisades, or the ones that are lightly damaged or not damaged, and be able to provide that kind of information again to carriers who want to get a sense of impact of their book. Claims management, right? We have to know where to send people. Where is it going to be safe to send people? Where is there going to be access issues because there's so much destruction in this area? Restoration, same questions, right? Where should we be sending our technicians? Where should we be identifying? What areas are the most efficient to identify? Where we should send people and start the process of restoration? Because you don't want to be sending people to a neighborhood that's far away, right? LA, it's already difficult enough to get across LA, not to mention now we throw in a couple of big wildfires, access issues are difficult. So being able to really target those areas so that process is incredibly efficient, economical. You're not wasting time and effort, because that's the name of the game when it comes to claims restoration, right? Doing things fast and efficient.
Yes. Okay, you've talked a little bit about coverage and claims and homeowners insurance and all those things. What is the data showing so far? I mean, it's already difficult, I think, in some areas of California to get insured, and some carriers have left California entirely. So what does your team believe may happen from fires like this? Is this making underwriting the risk harder? I'm sure that the data helps, but what do you think it looks like moving forward from here?
Oh, that's probably the $1 million question.
It
So
is.
we estimated that these fires, both of them, the Eaton fire and the Palisades fire combined, would cause about $35 to $45 billion of insured losses to insurance carriers. The midpoint about $40 billion. That was actually our initial estimate back in mid-January, and we've been sticking with that number. We feel very good about that, accounting not just for the property damage you can see, homes that are no longer there, or heavily damaged, properties where the damage isn't apparent from the naked eye. So it could be heavy smoke damage, this invisible damage that we talk about, where you might drive past it doing a damage survey and say, "Oh, that home looks fine. That's green, no damage." But if you go inside, it's like when you have like a bonfire in your backyard and your sweatshirt smells like smoke. Well, imagine if your entire house smelled like smoke for years. It's considered toxic, and you basically have to tear that home down to the studs and rebuild. So let's say you're thinking about modeled losses or insured losses. You might have said, well, this whole neighborhood's fine. We didn't see any damage. No, it's not fine. It actually might be total rebuilds. We'd be talking full losses. And the final thing is, of course, the additional living expenses. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are no longer able to access their home. They're going to have to find temporary lodging. You're going to have to deal with, I know there's been policies from the governor about price gouging, but obviously there's always bad eggs. And, it could be this example, right? Inflated costs from hotels or apartments. So it could be billions of dollars in additional living expenses. And it's really hard to get a sense of what that might be. And sure, our loss estimate number might be higher than some of the other model vendors. But that's because we're trying to account for these unforeseen damages, unforeseen insured losses that could stem from this. So back to your question about what does this mean for the industry underwriting cat risk management. What California has been doing and has done from a regulatory standpoint as of late should help to prevent this insurability crisis from expanding any further. So a lot of changes were implemented as of in January 1 of this year. Things like carriers being able to use models, stochastic models, like the models that CoreLogic produces, to be able to set insurance rates. So previously, carriers in California were restricted to using historical loss experience in their book to set the rates going forward. problem is if you're relying purely on historical loss experiences, your idea of risk is biased towards the areas that have already burned, but
Sure.
not the areas that haven't burnt yet, because you have no loss experience there.
Yep.
But if you use a model that can consider risk regardless of just purely historical loss experience, you can do things like, all right, well, this area up here, I'll just say, for example, down near San Diego, another dry part of California. Well, there's still a lot of wildfire risk here, and
Hmm.
something like what happened in LA could happen outside of San Diego as well. So we need to charge appropriately to make sure we're covering that risk. If carriers can do things like charge an actuarially sound rate, then when there are big events, and this is what insurance companies have to do. When there is a large disaster event, they have the funds to pay for the claims.
Hmm.
People can rebuild their home, go back to normal cycle, right? We just go back to doing it the way we always done it. So what we believe and what we hope is that any of the regulatory changes are going to make sure that California is still a appetizing market for insurance carriers to write it. It's a big market. There's a reason
Yep.
why there's a lot of insurance being written in California.
Yep.
It's a big market. It's just they want to make sure that they can charge what they need to charge to be able to stay in business. And I do believe that in that case, with the changes to the tools and data they can use, that I do believe that it will be a healthier insurance ecosystem in the state of California.
So how can restoration and cleaning contractors kind of help with this? When they're going through the restoration process, what are some things that they can do to help kind of lower the risk for property owners moving forward, help with premiums, those kind of things, make sure that their restoration is done correctly and also is more sustainable moving forward, which I know is a big push both in California and Florida, wherever there's areas of big cat risk.
Totally. So when it comes to the cleaning up and rebuilding, keeping the idea of wildfire mitigation in mind is incredibly important.
Yep.
We've things like a Class A roof when you rebuild your home, or when you're redoing the landscaping around your home, right? Designing the landscaping so that there is no brush within 5 feet or 15 feet of your property, no combustible materials attached to your home, like fences or what have you, something made out of combustible material. If we can do that, if everyone can do that when they rebuild, and if the restoration industry can sort of promote this is going to keep an event like this from happening again, at least an event of this magnitude. I'm not saying that it's going to stop wildfires from occurring, but if we can reduce the impact, then we don't have to deal with these $40 billion losses again. So, and we've looked into other areas that have been impacted by wildfires, thinking about mitigation. So we looked back to Paradise, California, the Camp Fire a few years ago, and we said, if you rebuild Paradise with wildfire risk in mind, whether that be building so there's more fire breaks within the high risk areas, keeping the brush out of the way, using the right materials for the home, it can reduce risk, model risk, a huge amount, and that has a direct impact on the insurance premiums that area would have to pay. And if insurance is more affordable, then that area is likely to maintain, the property values are likely to stay. Right? You're not going to lose this neighborhood. If people can afford insurance, they'll go back, they'll live there, and this area will continue to be a prosperous area. So the restoration industry is paramount in just the speed of being able to clean things. If people can get back into a new home quicker, there's additional living expenses. We don't have to deal with those as much as those. So speed at which we can clean up and rebuild, and then rebuild forward thinking is imperative that LA doesn't suffer permanently.
Is there anything that you see contractors can do as far as educating homeowners? Is there anything being done on the ground now to help educate homeowners on these ways of make sure when you hire a contractor, because there's many out there, that you're choosing one and choosing materials that are going to be more sustainable moving forward?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, obviously vetting anyone who's going to help clean up or rebuild is great. And if they're educated in risk management, wildfire, flood, what have you, that's great. The idea of risk education and who's responsible is a really important question. Is it on the home buyer themselves to do the education? Is it on their real estate agent or their lender or their insurer to tell them there's high risk there? And there's no I don't know what the right answer is. I think we should all be more educated on the risk. And I think the restoration industry, right? when you have your boots on the ground, you can see the effects of restoration. You're going into these areas that have been hit by fires or floods, and you can see the homes that were damaged, and you'll see the homes
Yep.
that aren't damaged, and you know what was the deciding factor there,
Mhm.
and you can be able to. And when you're working with a homeowner to clean up and rebuild, saying, hey, like you can rebuild this home like you had it before, and we can do this, go down this route. But if there is another fire, you might still be at risk. If you were to choose, again, I know it's a more expensive, right? Building with mitigation in mind is likely going to be more expensive materials.
Yep.
You have to make some sacrifices into how your home is designed. And I understand that, A, not everyone can afford it. And B, there's aesthetic choices that, it's your home. You want it to be your
Yep.
home. But anything you can do to prevent a large loss
Yep.
event like the LA wildfires from happening again is just right. So it obviously prevents the damage of your home, your neighbors' homes, the entire community. It keeps this sort of insurance crisis from getting any worse.
Mhm.
It's just a general healthier ecosystem. So I think it's really important, all of us, to be involved in the risk education uh, discussion. And I try to scream it to the top of my lungs whenever I can. But right, as long as if everyone is thinking about this when they're buying homes or buying insurance or contacting someone to help them rebuild or build a new home, keep risk in mind.
Yeah. Okay, you may have already answered this question, but I'm going to ask it as we kind of wrap things up. What would you say is like your number one piece of advice for restoration contractors to better understand? I'm actually going to take wildfire out of this, but to better
Yep.
understand risk in general. I mean, there's risk across the US, and I think actually contractors overplay hurricane season because there are so
Mhm.
many other things that can happen that are catastrophes, even if it's hail and wind damage that happens in the Midwest, or there's something that a big freeze in Texas or whatever. There's always large weather events that are happening. It's not just hurricanes and it's not just wildfires. So, what is something that you wish that restoration contractors better understood about maybe understanding the risk and looking at the data, maybe having a better idea of what's coming?
Yeah, I think a great point for this is that this idea that low risk doesn't mean no risk.
Yeah.
So areas that are seemingly devoid of natural disasters, there's really nowhere in this country where there's not going to be natural disasters.
Yeah.
You might not have fires. For example, I live in New England, right?
Okay.
So we still get wind. I live on the coast. We still get flooding. We still get snow, heavy
Yep.
snow, damage to roofs, right? It's low risk relative to Florida or California, but that doesn't mean there's no risk. And the
Yep.
same goes for the plains in the middle of the country where you have hail and you have wind. Just because there aren't these big events that get a lot of national news attention doesn't mean there's low risk. And these are areas that are going to need risk education, risk mitigation in mind for the rebuilding of these areas that are impacted. So, like, just because it's low risk doesn't mean no risk. There could be hailstorms on a near daily basis, or even heavy winds that can do pretty extensive damage to property. And it's really important that it's a problem that we all have to deal with across the globe. This is not a U.S. specific problem. There are natural disasters, and they're natural. They're naturally occurring phenomena. There's nothing that's going to stop them from happening, but we can prevent damage and loss by building back stronger, building back with risk education and risk mitigation in mind.
Yep. Perfect. Okay, Jon, anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
I would just say, right, our hearts are out to with all the people in LA who are having to rebuild. I know it's going to be an incredibly difficult process when you have so many homes that were damaged, and there's just so much need for the restoration industry to help. Right, just the cleaning up part of it alone is going to be a monumental effort. Obviously, we're always here. CoreLogic is here to support in the rebuilding and whatever we can do to provide from a data modeling or insight standpoint to help that process. We want to help.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay. So for people who are listening, you can find out more about Interconnect and register if you aren't yet at interconnect.corelogic.com. The new dates are March 23rd through 25th. Also, if you're interested in more data, CoreLogic puts out bulletins and updates and all of that all the time. And you can find a lot of those on the CoreLogic website as well. There's constantly things that are coming out that are updating you on trends and data in the industry. So be sure to check those out. There's been multiple updates from the wildfire, and there always are before, during, after other CAT events that happen. So be sure to check those out if you're data minded and want to know kind of what's happening. Jon, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to hopefully meeting you in person soon.
I hope so. Thank you so much, Michelle.
For more Restoration Today and the latest news, visit our website, cnrmagazine.com, and find the latest episodes of the Restoration Today podcast on your favorite podcasting platform.